Hi, this is Greg Kilstrom. Welcome to Season 3 of the Agile World, where we discuss customer and employee experience, organizational and workforce transformation, and how business can adapt and continually improve in an agile age. The Agile World podcast is brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. For more information, go to teksystems.com. To read more about the topics discussed in this show, you can go to my website at theagile.world and read my latest articles, or get a copy of my latest book, The Agile Workforce, now available on Amazon and other retailers. My name is Greg Kilstrom, and I'm the host of the Agile World podcast. Today we're going to talk about the critical role of leadership in company culture, more specifically about employee burnout and how leadership needs to address it. To help me discuss this topic, I'd like to welcome Mark Morey, founder of A Connected Leader. He works to transform outdated and struggling work environments into living systems of learning and growth. Mark, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Greg.
So let's looking forward to talking here. Let's start by talking about company culture and leadership's role. So just so we're all on the same page and the listeners kind of share our vocabulary here. How do you define company culture?
Well, company culture, there's all sorts of definitions, but essentially, this is the unseen and structured environment that guides people's both strategy, leadership, and operations. You could almost picture those three environments encircled by company culture. It's not just things coming out of HR for better benefit packages. It's unseen things. It's branding. It's rapport and relationships, how people get hired, consistency of values. It's not the values on the wall. It's how work gets done. So, I take a page from company culture by visiting other cultures. For example, I have quite a few friends that live in Europe and in Hawaii and indigenous people on this continent, and get a strong sense of, wow, this is not the same culture that I have, and how does it work? And really diving into that inquiry to get a sense how potent these invisible, I mean, some structures are visible, but mostly unseen and undiscussed guiding forms that really create the people inside the culture.
Can you give a little context on your background as well, and just your how that gives you a perspective on company culture?
Yeah. So my last 25 years has been really seeking to answer a big question, which has to do with human connection. And what does it take to have a community and a family that's raising children that are highly related to their environment, highly related to all the people around them, and developing themselves in the best way possible? Meaning, like, what's possible in the potential of being human? And so, in that inquiry, I was looking to solve the problem of disconnection, community isolation, uh, education and institutional problems that didn't quite serve me growing up, and noticing a lot of fragmentation in community and fragmentation in our society where people aren't as slow and connected as they used to be. And I think there's some systemic issues and results from that. Like, for example, there's a lot of articles on the effect technology has had on children and raising children, to the point where the tech heroes out in California, they don't even let their kids use technology to a certain age, right? So there's a lot of stressors and a lot of things that are affecting human development, and culture is a big aspect of that. So if we were to create an ideal scene of how to raise children and have a thriving family and thriving citizens in our society, how would we do it? And that was my driving quest for the last 20 years. And it led to developing nonprofits and for-profit organizations that specialized in a new kind of education that takes a look at all the ways in which human beings need to connect in order to thrive. Connection to self, connecting to others, competencies around that, and connecting to the living systems that we're a part of, because it's the ultimate context for our role as humans, I think. So that's my context. That's it. I've after all that
Yeah, and
inquiry
let's
and traveling the world and developing leadership programs to offer these courses in schools and internationally. Essentially, I was like, oh, we could bring this into the corporate environment because people are spending most of their life there, right? And so, how are they doing for company culture and community connection? And surprisingly, it's quite poor in most cases. So there's a lot of room here for improving
yeah.
it.
To talk a little bit more about, let's dive in a little more in the living systems approach that you talked about, and talk a little bit about something current right now that a lot of companies and a lot of leaders are dealing with, which is just burnout and some of the cultural organizational cultural issues that are coming up because of just everything that's been going on with the pandemic, with return to work, with remote work, and all of those things. What do you think can be learned and adapted from living systems that applies to and potentially helps us find solutions for some of these challenges?
Yeah, well, we're nested inside living systems, right? I mean, sometimes we might refer to it as nature, but it's not an abstract thing. We are part of the living system too, and developing an ability to observe how the living systems around us adapt to change. You know, it would be an interesting question to say: are the living systems in crisis around us? What paradigm are living systems coming from in terms of solving their problems? And how do we as humans deal with
Right.
crisis and change? And so that's kind of what I'm getting at, is there's some really deep, observable, and almost philosophical lessons that can be drawn into how we might design our cultures and communities to thrive. So, for example, development is a principle of a living system. And when we think about human beings or companies or businesses, we can talk about growth, which is an increase in size, versus development, which is an increase
Right.
in the quality of connections that are made. You can have both, but sometimes we mistake growth for development. Often, speed to market and scaling are measures of an effective startup or kind of like reaching a certain level of success in business. But if there isn't development along the way, then it starts to become an underperforming environment and the quality of connections drop. And if people aren't compensated in ways besides just financially, I think they start to experience the side effects or the secondary effects, which might be health issues, mental health issues, feeling isolated, trying to make up for it in other ways. So when we look at living systems, all the aspects that are interrelated are things that have a niche, that have a uniqueness. So another principle of a living system would be the notion of essence. What is the essential uniqueness of a certain species interacting in the whole? And when we apply that to communities, we have, I think, an obligation, because my background is in how do we raise children to become their best self. We have an obligation as a community to recognize that everyone is born unique and but undeveloped. So how do we foster that development towards their best self versus what I impose on them, versus like what I want, what I think is best for them? And that makes the
Yeah.
whole that they're a part of stronger, because now we have this principle of diversity and complexity. If we're all one size fits all solutions, we would just be robots and more of a mechanical worldview. But a living systems worldview accepts that everyone has their own unique path. So the structures in
Right.
a company culture need to be oriented towards that. For example, like if you took a leadership development program from a more machine paradigm, you would take something off the shelf with 10 leadership ideas and then worksheets and then run all your employees through the same thing, expecting the same results. And that's not what happens. So
Yeah.
the insight here is like, wow, what would it be like to actually design as if we were living systems, as we were unique? And so we have to be working from these principles.
how do you define kind of the breakdown between, what is leadership's responsibility in that, and where does what's the responsibility of the employee versus the leader, I guess, is the question.
Yeah. I think of leadership as a distributed quality, not necessarily a hierarchical one. I know that people can be managers their whole life and never approach leadership. They can certainly be executives and be missing out on some of those skills. But if we think of it as a developmental quality, then we can say that we all have a role in making the environment healthier and more thriving. And that includes, towards the strategic objectives of the company. So what we're seeing right now with burnout is it's like an epidemic. There's a huge amount of research that's been pouring out because of the pandemic that has unearthed a pre-existing problem, a crisis that was already underway. And the symptoms of burnout kind of fall into different categories. One would be exhaustion. Another would be kind of a social cynicism, which has to do with isolation, feelings of isolation. And the third might be a drop in self-esteem. So there are ways in which companies have a responsibility to address this. But most efforts they're documenting, Harvard Business Review did a huge article on this. Most efforts that companies are trying to solve this are failing. So why is it failing? Well, I believe that it's inviting us, because it's a crisis already in the making and it's such huge proportions, that it's inviting us to actually evolve companies to be more like how human beings and living systems actually operate. So leadership is accepting the tension of a problem and a need, right? And a solution that's not here yet, and growing to match that tension. So there's an invitation to grow here. So, for example, leadership development, a really strong role is how do you structure an ongoing learning environment at work as work gets done? And also
Yeah.
placing yourself in that process. So as opposed to I'm outside the process, I'm the leader, I'm the expert, and then of course there's constant change and uncertainty, so you really are not, but you have to now pretend to be, or put a buffer between you and your employees and never show them your real self. Leadership is actually accepting that vulnerability and being part of the reciprocity learning environment, meaning I'm in it too. I still have my role as a leader that I don't relinquish, but I'm actually showing transparently that I'm in a learning process too. And that really changes the way everybody has permission to step into what is their tension that they're reconciling and being invited to grow in. So that takes time and attention. So it takes leadership to say, we're going to structure a regular learning environment. I'm doing this in Google right now. So for example, a friend of mine there went to his director and he said, "What's the number one issue you're concerned about right now? With the pandemic and remote work." And he said,
Yeah.
manager burnout. And he's seeing that people are underperforming, right? They're sliding into kind of a social isolation issue. They're not replenishing themselves. And I just saw surveys that said 40% of employees are actively looking for another job, and the executives are unaware of that. So there was a question here
Oh,
of
yeah.
how do
I
we
saw
address
something
this?
similar.
Have you heard that?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I've seen similar numbers, and just that some large percentage of that is going to probably change jobs in the next year, as well. So not only are they looking, but they're not just window shopping. In other words, they're gonna make some changes. So yeah,
Maybe change their career. Yeah. So I think what's really engaging right now in terms of leadership, company culture, and burnout is we have a choice point. And the map is, for me, moving from isolation to connection. But the choice point is, do we try to go back to the way things were? Just wait for it, return to normal? Or do we recognize that it's a moving target? Change is underfoot. And if it's not the 40% looking for another job, it's the huge wave of millennials coming who would want nothing to do with the old work paradigm.
Do you think there is a going back at this point, even, or is that just a false assumption?
It is, but this is why I'm calling it a choice, because it is a choice to say, I'm putting my head
Yeah,
in the sand,
yeah,
right? I want to try to
right,
arrest
right.
this
Fair enough.
chaos. I want to try to slow it down. I want to pretend it's not here. I want to go into denial. That's a paradigm. It's a way of being. People who are rules and structures and try to create conditions for every potential problem that's going to happen, and they're just always painting themselves into a corner. That's a style. But another choice is to consider, how do we evolve under this pressure? Like, crisis is another word for it, is challenge, right? Is another word for invitation. And the emphasis I want to make here is around evolving capacity. So this is the key, I think. We don't like having to grow as people generally. It happens under pressure. But when we actively choose it, we can actually develop a sense of personal agency in the process. Like, we can do something about this, as opposed to feeling like a victim and I'm waiting around for someone to come solve my problem. So that's,
Yeah.
an upward spiral, right, of positive things that could be happening from this.
Right. Do you have some specific actionable practices that that you can recommend? I mean, obviously, every organization is a little different, and whether they're a large, small, industry specific or whatever. But are there some general things that leaders can do that are that help mitigate some of this and or actively improve on some of these challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have some real specific instruments, different approaches that people can use, tips, and then I want to talk about the technology of
Yeah.
those, because there's a way in which they, not technology in the traditional sense, but in the interaction of those different instruments, like a social technology. For example, we could quit our job, right, and try to move somewhere else and have something else happen, or quit our relationship. But often, if we don't grow from that event, we just repeat the same things that happen again. So we want to create a technology
Yeah.
that um, begins there's like three aspects that are super powerful. I'm going to call it a triad of self mastery. And I think it can work at the organizational level as well. You certainly could do this in teams. So this is the framework, and then I'll give you the instruments. This is the technology. So the primary one is self-observing and building the capacity to self-observe. Because we can have a routine and a habit, but if we don't notice that we have one, we don't have access to changing it. And this is personal agency oriented. Where is the locus of control? Is it inside me or is it outside me? And it begins with noticing. So that requires a regular practice of inviting yourself to notice. How do you do that? Well, in a culture, or a company culture or a community, you can set up structures for self-reflection. So I created a number of these in different companies. For about 4 years, I was in this tech company, and the COO, she was really sharp on proactive behaviors, because the best prevention, right? The best solution is prevention in all of this. How do you ride the wave of disruptions? So one of the best things you can put into place is not a prescriptive, fragmented program that begins and ends, but you just keep it in the culture ongoingly. So we developed these cross-functional self-reflection teams, where once a week they'd get together, and I would walk them through some frameworks that cause them to observe their actual work challenges as well as their life challenges, because work life are integrating really tight right now, right? So in that process,
Yeah.
we developed a conversation between people in the room, where they're not giving advice to each other. They're not coaching each other. They're really inviting, through open-ended questions, the other person to reflect on themselves and notice what is going on, what changes they made, and what they might want to do differently in that process. So that's the first part. The second part of the self-mastery triangle is self-remembering. Now, this one is particularly powerful because it's where you locate yourself. Do you ever feel like you've been lost? Feel like, I don't even know what I'm doing here. A friend of mine got promoted to a job after really working on this promotion, and he got there and he's like, is this it? Like, what am I doing? And certainly
Right.
social isolation can cause this kind of a feeling, but sometimes we just don't know how to get back to ourselves. So there is technology around how to self-remember, how to get back in alignment with, let's say, our purpose, right? And our uniqueness that I was saying before. So that's the second one.
Yeah.
And then the third, that really, you can now see how they fit together. Self-observe, self-remember, and the third is self-manage. This is kind of the agile holy grail, right? Self-managing teams, a culture of self-management. Yeah. But the other two aspects are primary, because where is that self-management skill going to come from? Repeating from the past, or upgrading as you get to know your living system self, right? Because you're changing and shifting and noticing new things. Then your self-management has to change. So those three things is the technology that sets up the next couple of things I'm going to tell you about. But now this is where they get really specific. So when we set up these cross-functional self-reflection teams, I also did leadership retreats with this method, and we're going to do this with Google over Zoom even. There's three techniques we can use to create awareness. And then there are three that we can work with that create meaning making. And that's how you lead to understanding and processing what this new awareness you're experiencing is. If we only did self-observing, we really wouldn't get to self-managing, right? We have to notice and then make meaning out of that noticing. So the first kind of awareness raiser is gratitude. And a lot of people kind of give a cheaper version of what I think gratitude is really about. Gratitude is, for example, it's not thanking people for things. It's not acknowledgement. It's not even honoring, in a sense. It's gratitude, and its I think original practice is a voluntary act of humility, where you're acknowledging what you're dependent on and interdependent with, counting your blessings, so to speak. And in that moment, there's a feeling of reverence, maybe awe, humility. And those three qualities actually, they have an internal effect on how people view the world. And this is well studied. Gratitude and being thankful is actually super universal, even though, ancient humans didn't walk around and plan this. But you can go to any culture on the planet and they've got routines around this as a survival technology. Especially you go to native communities. Why is gratitude at the center of their survival community, so to speak? Because it shifts your perspective. It shifts your sense of what life's worth living for. Because we get into a negative mindset, it actually could end up killing ourselves or other people. So gratitude is key, and I consider it a leadership instrument, because you have to mentally choose what you're going to focus on. Because I often don't feel grateful when I begin a gratitude practice. That's not what it's about. It's not waiting till I'm grateful. It's actually shifting my mind. Right. And then the upgrade is, what's that like when you do that with other people? I imagine a world where people at work can actually have practical and really engaging moments of gratitude as part of meetings, for example. Because, meetings are killing people, right? Death by meetings. Imagine if gratitude was a protocol to opening and closing a meeting, which is how I run my company. It's a totally different experience. So that's tops.
Yeah, that's interesting.
The other two on the awareness raising side, they can be combined, which is it's about nature connection. So this is a uniqueness that I think is unusual. I'm bringing the idea that human beings have evolved with the natural world since the beginning. And if we remove ourselves from it, then we're actually reducing our human development potential. We're actually not developing ourselves. Even if we take classes and we're reading books and we're, exercising in the gym, if we're not actually engaged outdoors in the natural world in an embodied, curious sense, there's something missing. And people notice it, right? Where do you go when you go on vacation? You start looking for natural areas to go to, right? Go to the beach, go to the sea, go to a cabin. What if our year-round experience was connected to nature, like backyard style? So I propose that we integrate nature connection as part of work, like not wait till the weekend when we're exhausted, but throughout every workday. How would that look? And I've been experimenting with this in a number of different companies. Nike this past year, we did a lot of that, and they were totally open to it because we were framing it as cross training. That this was the tech department of Nike, and they were really struggling because of a constant reorg that never ended. And it was really getting them down. Like burnout was just rampant. And so we brought in this ongoing practice of what we call the sit spot on campus, beautiful campus. There's some places where you could go and actually sit by a stream and actively engage your senses. So this is the other awareness practice. And I found some places when I was cruising around on campus looking for a place for these people to hang out. I was like, they probably don't know there's these natural areas here. So I started going down this stream bank. There's a little path that humans had created. And I was like, oh, look at this. Some humans created this path. There's no sidewalk. And there I found a crate, like a plastic milk crate on the bank. I'm like, look, see, there it is. Someone's already doing this. And as I sat there, a beaver swam up this little stream. I noticed all these beaver chews and all this activity, and birds were flying in the bushes. And I thought, wow, this is like not only relaxing, it's educational. This is really an amazing spot. So you walk in super refreshed in like 15 minutes.
Yeah.
So those are those trio of things: gratitude, connecting to your senses, and the sit spot. Now, the second half of it is, how do you make meaning on that? And this is where we have to get into the power of reflection. So the first instrument is journaling, but not just journaling, it's journaling with good questions, where you rigorously walk through a series of questions that kind of take you back to the beginning of the day or back to the beginning of the week. And you could do that live, which is what I think increases the social aspect of this. You could do a journaling process with another person called Story of the Day, where the agreement is you're asking open-ended questions to engage the person's original thinking. Because if you ask a closed-ended questions, you get a yes or a no. Or sometimes you just get a single answer because you're making a statement. But when you ask an open-ended question, there's a big risk because you don't know what they're going to say. And they don't either. And what the best part about it is you can see on their face when you ask a good question, you say, oh, what happened to work today? Oh, this other thing. You say, oh, what was that telling you about yourself? What is that? How does it reflect on your past, quarter this year? What are you learning about this? And you see their eyes roll up and they go, oh, good question. Let's see. And if you have an agreement on that, work is fun because you're learning all the time, even from small, nuanced engages. Why did I react? Why did I do the same thing? Why am I waiting things to return to normal? Maybe we aren't returning to normal. Those kinds of things. And then lastly, tied in there, these are kind of a framework, so they're hard to separate, is the art of questioning. This is a role that has an intentional approach to conversation where you're asking meaning-making questions, but you don't know what the result is. And you're really paying attention to the other person and what they're saying, and you're tracking them in a sense. You're following them and wondering, I wonder how this is related to their uniqueness. Oh, I wonder how this is related to the last set of problems they were talking about. Oh, I wonder how this is related to where this person wants to go next. And you just ask, but you don't project or solve the problem for them. And what you're building here is their own sovereignty and personal agency to self-manage, which is, one of our goals with all of this. And self-remember, I think human beings are really an important part of remembering who we are. So those are the primary instruments. And I have a write-up, a series of emails that I send out to people that can go to my website, and I'll walk you through all of these things on my website at Connected Leader.
Yeah, that'd be great, and I'd love to include those in the show notes. If you don't mind, I can include a link to
Yeah,
the site.
I'm just going to put it under podcast resources because people keep asking me, "Oh, those are a cool story. Can you show me a little bit about how you do gratitude at work?" I really want to do that. So just go to aconnectedleader.com/podcast, and you'll see that.
Wonderful. Well, yeah, I wish we had more time to talk today, but really appreciate you sharing those. I mean, I think it's a fascinating subject, and really, I'd love to have you back and ask you some more questions as well. So, I think we should definitely do that. But in the meantime, in addition to your website, are any other ways people can reach out and connect with you?
Yeah, if you're a manager and you're struggling with any of these kinds of signs and symptoms of burnout, you certainly can go to that podcast resource page. If you're an executive, you want to run a program like this, just reach out to me on LinkedIn, which you'll see Mark Morey on LinkedIn, a Connected Leader.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again for joining the show, and I'd like to thank Mark Morey, founder of A Connected Leader. Thanks again for listening to The Agile World with Greg Kihlstrom. See you next week. Thanks again for listening to the Agile World podcast, brought to you by Tech Systems. I'm your host, Greg Kihlstrom. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to subscribe on your podcast channel of choice and leave us a rating so that others can find the show more easily. You can learn more and get a copy of my latest book, The Agile Workforce, from my website at theagile.world.